crystal chandelier above the VIP floor of the Crown Serpent Casino threw fractured light. Across the carnage below, two bodies lay crumpled near the baccarat tables, blood soaking into the hand-woven Persian carpet in slow, creeping circles. Dealers had fled. Security had sealed the doors. The air tasted like gunpowder and expensive cologne, and somewhere in the distance, a jazz singer on the main floor kept performing because nobody had told her to stop. But Kyu-Bong wasn't looking at the bodies. He stood at the top of the mezzanine staircase, one tattooed hand resting on the gold banister, his charcoal suit jacket hanging open to reveal a white dress shirt, unbuttoned dangerously low. Dark ink crawled up his neck and spread across his chest, serpents, chrysanthemums, skulls. With Korean scripture threaded between them, each tattoo a chapter of violence he had, authored personally. His dark hair fell across his forehead in tousled strands, and his sharp cheekbones caught the amber light in a way that made him look carved from something cold. His jaw was tight. His eyes, though his eyes were somewhere else entirely. They were locked on her. She sat in the dead center of the chaos like it had been arranged around her for decoration, an ornate velvet chair, the kind that belonged in a European palace, not a Las Vegas casino, held her like a throne. Her legs were crossed. Her posture was loose, almost bored. One arm draped lazily over the side of the chair, while the other held a crystal glass of whiskey, the amber, liquid catching the chandelier light as she tilted it, slowly, against her lips. Cecile Julian. She wore a deep crimson suit that fit her body like it had been stitched onto her skin sharp. Shoulders, gold buttons gleaming down the front, the blazer open just enough to reveal a collarbone dusted with faint gold shimmer. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant, voluminous updo that exposed the full architecture of her face, flawless bronze skin, high cheekbones, full lips painted a shade darker than her suit. Small gold earrings caught the light when she turned her head. And her expression, God, her expression. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shock. It was a smirk, slight, knowing, and devastatingly calm, as if two dead men on the floor were simply the cost of a mildly interesting evening. Kyu-Bong descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, his Italian leather shoes clicking. Against the marble, his 4 lieutenants flanked him, massive men in black suits with holstered weapons barely concealed beneath their jackets. The entire VIP floor had been cleared, every exit guarded, every camera re-angled. This was his kingdom, and every molecule of air in it answered to him. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped 6 feet from her chair. She didn't stand. She didn't flinch. She took another sip of whiskey and looked up at him the way someone watches rain through a window with mild, detached interest. "You're sitting in a crime scene," Kyu-Bong said. His voice was low, controlled, but threaded with something electric, dangerous. "Most people run. Most people bore me," she replied. Her voice was unhurried, warm, like honey overcrushed. "Glass." He tilted his head. A slow smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, not a kind smile. The smile of a predator who had just spotted something rare. He stepped closer, close enough that his shadow fell across her like a cage. Then he leaned down, both tattooed hands gripping the arms of her chair, his face inches from hers, his body towering over her seated frame. She didn't lean back, not even a centimeter. "What's your name?" he asked, and it wasn't a question. It was the first move in a claim. "Cecile," she said. She held his gaze without blinking. "And you're Kyu-Bong, the man who owns this carpet I'm getting blood on." Something shifted behind his eyes, a flash of heat, of hunger, of something far more obsessive than attraction. He studied her the way a collector studies a painting he intends to steal. Her calmness didn't repel him. It ignited him. In a world where everyone either feared him or performed for him, this woman sat in the wreckage of his violence and looked at him like he was simply interesting. He straightened up, adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, and turned to his head lieutenant without taking his eyes off her. "Clear the floor," he said quietly, "and cancel my meetings for the rest of the week." His lieutenant blinked. "Sir, the Busan delegation arrives, Tom." "I said cancel them." The room emptied in under a minute, and Cecile Julian sat in that velvet chair watching the most dangerous man in the American underworld rearrange his entire world around her, and she let the smirk settle a little deeper into her lips. Because Kyu-Bong had just done exactly what she needed him to do. He had noticed her. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, because the truth was buried under 7 layers of falsified identities, ghost accounts, and a trail of dead informants, was that Cecile Julian was not a high roller. She was not a socialite. She was not some fearless woman who wandered into danger by accident. She was the heir to the Julian Syndicate, the last surviving crime family that had been systematically dismantled by Kyu-Bong's empire over the past decade. Her father had been murdered. Her family's territories had been absorbed. Their name had been erased from every ledger in the underworld as if they had never existed. And she had spent 4 years training, bleeding, and rebuilding herself in silence for this exact moment. The moment a man ruled by obsession would see her, want her, and drag her willingly into the belly of his empire. She wasn't caught in his web. She was the web. And tonight, sitting in that chair with whiskey on her lips and blood at her feet, the most dangerous game of her life had officially begun. Kyu-Bong returned to his penthouse that night, 62 floors above the Las Vegas Strip, and he could not stop seeing her face. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittering below him like a kingdom of fallen stars, and he pressed his tattooed knuckles against the cold glass and replayed every second. The way she held the glass, the way her voice curled around. His name like she had already memorized it. The way she sat rooted, sovereign, unbothered, while his world burned around her. He had taken everything from everyone who had ever challenged him. He had built a criminal empire that stretched from Las Vegas to Seoul, funded by casinos, arms, and fear. He answered to no one. His name alone could collapse a stock price, empty a nightclub, or end a life. But her, that woman in crimson, she had looked at him like none of it mattered. And he needed to know why. By the next morning, he had deployed 3 of his best operatives to build a file on Cecile Julian. By noon, they had returned with exactly what she had designed them to find, a carefully constructed legend. Wealthy family, old money, private, a taste for high-stakes gambling, and expensive whiskey. No criminal ties, no affiliations, just a beautiful, independent woman who moved through the world on her own terms. It was a perfect lie, and Kyu-Bong swallowed it whole not because he was careless, but because he wanted it to be true. Because the alternative that she was something more dangerous than he could imagine would mean he couldn't have her. And Kyu-Bong always took what he wanted. That evening, his men delivered a gift to her hotel suite, a black velvet box containing a bracelet, worth more than most people's homes, and a handwritten note in his sharp, slanting script. "Dinner, tomorrow, 8 p.m., the Crown Serpent. Refusal is not one of the options." Cecile read the note, set it down beside the bracelet, and picked up her encrypted phone. She dialed a number she had memorized years ago, the only number that connected her to the ghost network of the Julian Syndicate's surviving operatives. "He took the bait," she said quietly. A pause on the other end. Then a voice, low and cautious. "How deep are you willing to go?" Cecile looked at the bracelet, then at the city beyond her window, his city, his lights, his empire built on the bones of her family. "As deep as it takes," she whispered, "until I'm sitting in his chair." She ended the call, opened the velvet box, and clasped the bracelet onto her wrist. Then she poured herself a glass of whiskey, settled into the chair by the window, and began, piece by piece, to plan the destruction of the man who thought he was claiming her. The game had begun, and Cecile Julian played to win. The dinner was not a request, it was a summoning. Cecile arrived at the Crown Serpent Casino at exactly 8 o'clock, not a minute early, not a minute late because precision was a language Kyu-Bong understood, and she intended to speak it fluently. The elevator doors parted onto the 62nd floor, a private dining level that most of Las Vegas didn't even know existed, and the first thing she noticed was the silence. No music, no chatter, no clinking glasses from neighboring tables, just the low hum of climate-controlled air and the faint, distant pulse of the tame. Casino floors far below, muffled to nothing by layers of concrete, glass, and money. The room was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the entire Las Vegas skyline like a painting he owned. A single table sat in the center, draped in black linen, set for two with crystal stemware and flatware that gleamed under soft, recessed lighting. White orchids rare, expensive, deliberately chosen floated in shallow glass bowls along the window ledge. Everything was curated. Everything was controlled. This was not a restaurant. It was a stage, and he was the director. Kyu-Bong stood at the far window with his back to her, one tattooed hand cradling a glass of scotch, the other buried in the pocket of his black trousers. He wore a dark suit. No tie, collar open, the ink on his neck climbing above the fabric like something caged, trying to escape. When he heard her heels on the marble, he didn't turn. Immediately, he let the moment stretch, let the silence do its work, because men like him understood that anticipation was its own kind of violence. When he finally turned, Cecile was already seated. She had chosen the chair facing the window, crossing her legs beneath the table, one hand resting on the linen surface, the other adjusting the gold bracelet he had sent her. She wore crimson again, a fitted dress this time, off the shoulder, the fabric catching, the low light like liquid. Her hair was down tonight, dark curls brushing her collarbone. The gold earrings were the same, the smirk was the same, and the calm, that impossible, maddening calm, was exactly the same. Kyu-Bong studied her for a long moment, then smiled, not warmly, the way a wire tightens before it cuts. "You wore my gift," he said, walking toward the table. "I wore jewelry," Cecile corrected, meeting his eyes. "Whether it's yours is a matter of perspective." He sat down across from her, and for the first time, they were face to face with nothing between them but candlelight and intention. His eyes moved over her slowly, not the way a man admires a woman, but the way a man inventories something he has already decided belongs to him. Every detail catalogued, every inch claimed. "Tell me about yourself, Cecile Julian," he said, leaning back. "And don't lie to me, No." She smiled. "No, you won't." And she was right. She was absolutely right. But he didn't know that yet. And that single, devastating miscalculation was the crack in his fortress that she had been trained her entire life to exploit. She gave him exactly what he wanted, a story. The right story. Raised in New Orleans. Father in shipping, mother in philanthropy. Old money, quiet money, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. She liked whiskey neat, poker over blackjack, silence over small talk. She had traveled the world alone since she was 22. She answered to no one. She delivered each detail with the rhythm of a woman recalling memories, not reciting a script. A pause here, a half-smile there, the way she looked down at her glass when she mentioned her father as if the memory still carried weight. It was a masterclass in deception, and she performed it with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this legend so many times it had calcified into something indistinguishable from memory. Every word was a carefully constructed lie, but the genius of Cecile's cover wasn't the Fiction, it was the truth she threaded through it. She really did prefer whiskey neat. She really was fearless. She really did move through the world like a woman who answered to no one. The lies were scaffolding. The truth was the foundation. And Kyu-Bong walked across it without ever feeling the ground shift. He asked about her father, and she told him Marcus Julian was a shipping magnate who died of a heart attack when she was 19. In reality, Marcus Julian was a crime lord who was executed in the back of a restaurant in Queens with 2 bullets to the procket skull, ordered by the very man sitting across from her, slicing into a $30 cut of Wagyu beef. She said it with such convincing sadness that Kyu-Bong reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His tattooed fingers were warm. The gesture was almost gentle, and Cecile held his gaze and let the moment settle, feeling the weight of his hand over hers, feeling the grotesque irony of a murderer comforting the orphan he had made. By the end of dinner, he was leaning forward on his elbows, his scotch forgotten, his eyes never leaving her face. She had done something no one had done in years. She had made him forget himself. Not his power, not his name, but the exhausting performance of being Ri Kyu-Bong, the unchallengeable king. She spoke to him like he was simply a man, and something in him, something buried deep beneath the draft. Tattoos and the violence and the years of isolation responded to that like oxygen to a flame. "Stay," he said at the end of the night. Not a command, not yet. Something roar. Almost a question. "I have a hotel room," she said, standing. "I have a city," he said it quietly, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. He wasn't offering, he was warning. Cecile held his gaze for 3 full seconds, long enough to make him feel the silence, short enough to leave him wanting. Then she turned and walked toward the elevator. Without looking back, her heels echoed in the empty room like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Behind her, Kyu-Bong stood at the table and watched her disappear behind closing doors. Then he picked up his phone and called his head of security. "The woman who just left," he said. "I want to know everywhere she goes, everyone she speaks to, every breath she takes, starting now." He set the phone down and looked at the chair where she had been sitting. A faint trace of her perfume lingered in the air, something warm, layered like amber and smoke, and the ghost of a fire that hadn't started yet. He didn't know it, but it had. Before we continue, go ahead and subscribe, like, and share where you're watching from. It always warms my heart to see our little storytelling family stretch across the world. Every click, every comment, every bit of love you give helps us keep uncovering these unforgettable stories together. So find your quiet place, settle in, and let me take you somewhere you've never been before. Over the next 3 weeks, Cecile played the game with surgical patience. She appeared at the Crown Serpent on her own terms, never when summoned, never when expected. She would materialize at the high roller tables like a rumor made flesh, always in something sharp and crimson, always with that crystal glass of whiskey, always alone. She won at poker with a quiet confidence that drew the attention of every man in the room and held none of their gazes except one. Kyu-Bong watched her from the mezzanine, from the security feeds, from the reports. His men delivered every morning. He learned her patterns, her preferences, her habits. She tipped the dealers generously. She never gambled more than she could afford. She left precisely when she was ahead. Never greedy, never reckless. She was disciplined. And discipline, to a man like Kyu-Bong, was the most intoxicating quality a person could possess. He sent gifts. She returned most of them. He sent invitations. She declined half. He arranged for the penthouse suite at the Bellagio to be offered to her at no charge. She checked out the next morning and moved to a smaller hotel on the other side of the strip, further from his reach, closer to his obsession. She was doing exactly what her training demanded, creating scarcity, manufacturing, desire, making herself the only variable in his life he couldn't control. And it was working. Every returned gift made him send a more extravagant one. Every declined invitation made the next one more desperate. She was pulling him toward her by pushing him away, and Kyu-Bong, a man who had never been denied anything, found himself completely consumed. His lieutenants noticed. Park Song-min, his intelligence chief, mentioned it once. Carefully, the way a man mentions a loaded weapon in a room full of fumes. This woman, sir, we've run her background 3 times. It's clean, perhaps too clean. Kyu-Bong looked at him with a coldness that ended the conversation permanently. Song-min bowed his head and didn't raise the subject again, but he kept his own file on. Cecile Julian. He was a patient man, and patience had kept him alive in an industry that devoured the reckless. Meanwhile, Cecile transmitted her preliminary reports through dead drops at 3 separate locations across the strip, a locker at a gym on Flamingo Road, a hollowed-out book in a used bookstore on Fremont Street, and a modified USB drive left. In the bathroom of a diner on Boulder Highway, each drop required a different disguise, a different route, a different window of time. She moved through the city like smoke, visible one moment and gone the next, always returning to the crown serpent before anyone noticed her absence. One night, she let him sit beside her at the poker table. Their shoulders almost touched. She could smell his cologne, dark, woody, something expensive and sharp like cedar, and cold steel. His tattooed hands rested on the green felt, and she studied them from the corner of her eye while pretending to study her cards. The ink was intricate. Serpents coiling around his knuckles, Korean characters running down each finger, a chrysanthemum blooming across the back of his left hand, hands that had built empires, hands that had destroyed them. "You're not afraid of me," he said, not looking at her, stacking chips with mechanical precision. "Should I be? Everyone else is." She placed her cards face down on the table and turned to him. Their faces were close. Close enough that she could see the faint scar running along his jawline, the slight darkness beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the way his pupils dilated, almost imperceptibly when he looked at her. "Maybe," she said softly, "you're tired of people who are afraid of you." The words landed somewhere deep. She could see it, a micro-expression, a flicker of something unguarded that crossed his face and vanished before anyone else could have caught it. But Cecile caught it. She was trained to catch it, and she stored it in the same mental file where she kept every useful piece of intelligence. Only this one, she realized later, she didn't file under useful. She filed it under something she didn't have a name for yet. He won the hand. She let him not, obviously, not in any way that a professional poker player would notice, but with a subtle enough tell that he would feel, on some subconscious level, that he had earned the victory rather than been given it. It was a small thing, the kind of invisible gift that operatives learn to give targets to accelerate bonding. But as she watched him collect his chips with those inked hands, a faint smile. On his lips, not the predatory smile, but a quieter one, almost boyish, she felt. Something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with strategy. 2 days later, his lieutenant delivered a message. Not a gift, not an invitation, an address, and a single line. "Come home." Not visit. Not join me. Come home, as if the estate she had never set foot in was already hers, as if their future together was a fact he had decided without consulting her. It was the most revealing thing he had ever communicated, that in his mind she already belonged there. She already belonged to him. Cecile stood in her hotel room, staring at the card, and felt the first tremor of something. She hadn't anticipated not fear, but recognition. She recognized the loneliness, encoded in those 2 words because she had carried her own version of it for years. The mission hadn't accounted for that. Her training hadn't prepared her for the possibility that the monster she was hunting might also be a man. She buried the thought, picked up her phone and called her handler. "He's inviting me in," she said. "Then go in. Map everything. Financials, security rotations, personnel. We need it all." She ended the call, packed a single bag, and went. The estate sat in the hills above Las Vegas, hidden behind 12-foot walls, motion sensor cameras, and a security detail that rotated every 6 hours. It was obscene in its beauty, a sprawling compound of dark stone, glass, and manicured. Gardens, with a view of the desert that stretched to the horizon like an ocean of dust and heat. Inside, it was cold, not in temperature, but in spirit. Every surface was polished. Every room was immaculate. Every piece of furniture was expensive and untouched. Like a museum exhibit no one was allowed to enjoy. Kyu-Bong gave her the east wing, a suite with a private terrace, a walk-in closet already. Stocked with clothes in her size, crimson, black, gold, always her colors, always. Chosen with obsessive attention to detail, and a bathroom with marble floors and a soaking tub that overlooked the city lights. Fresh orchids appeared every morning, white and pristine, arranged in crystal vases she never asked for. A personal chef prepared anything she requested. A security detail of 4 men stood outside her door at all hours, described as protection, but functioning as exactly what they were: sentinels. At the mouth of a cage. It was lavish. It was suffocating. It was a gilded cage dressed as a palace, and Cecile recognized it for exactly what it was the moment she crossed the threshold. She recognized it because she had been briefed on Kyu-Bong's patterns, his need to collect, to contain, to keep beautiful things under glass where they could be admired, but never truly free. He had done it with art, with cars, with property. Now he was doing it with her. The only difference was that this particular acquisition was looking back at him, with eyes that catalogued every vulnerability the glass revealed. But she smiled. She unpacked. She settled in. And then she went to work. Every night, she dined with him. Every night, the conversation grew longer, deeper, more layered. He told her about his childhood in Busan, the poverty, the violence, the father who drank and the mother who prayed, and the streets that taught him the only language the world respected was force. He told her about his rise, how he had clawed his way from nothing to everything, building a criminal empire one betrayal at a time. He told her things he had never told anyone, and each confession was a key, and each key opened a door that Cecile walked through with silent, meticulous precision. During the day, while he conducted business in the compound's West Wing meetings, with arms dealers, accountants laundering millions through shell corporations, lieutenants reporting on territorial disputes, Cecile explored. She memorized the layout of the estate within 3 days, the camera blind spots within 5, the security rotation schedule within a week. She found his private office on the 7th day, waited for his head of security to leave for his evening shift change, and spent 43 minutes photographing financial documents with a micro camera disguised as a button on her blazer. Account numbers, shell companies, fund transfers routed through banks in Seoul, Macau, the Cayman Islands, the architecture of his empire laid bare in spreadsheets and ledgers, and she transmitted every byte of it to her handler through an encrypted signal buried in the estate's own Wi-Fi network, a ghost living inside his walls, feeding on his secrets while sleeping in his silk sheets. She memorized the names and faces of every lieutenant, every captain, every soldier who entered the compound. She noted who Kyu-Bong trusted and who he merely tolerated. She observed the hierarchy, the subtle politics of a criminal court, who sat closest to him at dinner, who was allowed to speak first in meetings, who flinched when he raised his voice, and who held steady. She catalogued their weaknesses. 1. Lieutenant had a gambling addiction that was bleeding him dry. Another was sleeping with the wife of a rival underboss, a secret that could be detonated at any moment. Third, a quiet, stone-faced man named Jeon Tae-sik had a daughter with a medical condition that required treatment Kyu-Bong's organization paid for. Leverage. All of it. Every person was a pressure point. Every secret a thread she could pull when the time came. She filed it all away, transmitted what was actionable, and kept the rest locked in the vault of her extraordinary memory. The Julian Syndicate's surviving strategists, operating from a basement in Brooklyn, were building a three-dimensional model of Kyu-Bong's empire based entirely on the intelligence she was feeding them. They had never gotten this close. No one had. But the nights were dangerous in a different way. After dinner, he would walk her to her wing, and each night he lingered a little longer at her door. His eyes held things he couldn't say: want, possession, something that might have been tenderness if it hadn't been so tangled up with control. He never forced himself on her. That was the part that disoriented her. She had been prepared for a brute, a predator without restraint. Instead, she found a man who stood at her door with tattooed hands shaking almost imperceptibly, waiting for permission he didn't know how to ask for because no one had ever taught him how. One night, 3 weeks into her stay, he brought her whiskey on the terrace. They sat in. The desert darkness, the city glittering below like a circuit board, and he was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of its usual edge. "Before you," he said. This place was silent. She looked at him. Really looked, not through the analytical lens of an operative, assessing a target, but with the unguarded eyes of a woman sitting across from a man who had just admitted he was lonely in the only language he had. "It's still silent," she said gently. "You just don't notice it when I'm here." He turned to her, and in the low light his face was different, younger, softer, the sharp angles and predatory focus replaced by something raw and almost unbearably human. He reached for her hand. His tattooed fingers closed around hers, and she felt the roughness of his knuckles, the warmth of his skin, the faint tremor that betrayed the truth he would never speak aloud, that he was terrified, not of enemies or rivals or death, terrified of being exactly what he was, a man who had everything and held nothing. Cecile let him hold her hand, and something inside her, something carefully compartmentalized and locked away in a vault she had built years ago when her father was murdered, and her family's name was burned from the underworld's memory, that something shifted, cracked, let in light she hadn't invited. She thought of her father, Marcus Julian, who had held her hand just like this when she was small, walking her through the French Quarter, buying her beignets at Café du Monde, telling her stories about her grandmother who had come from Port-au-Prince with nothing and built a dynasty from sheer will. She thought of the last time she saw him alive, standing in the doorway of their house in New Orleans, waving goodbye, telling her he'd be back by dinner. He wasn't. He was never back for anything again. And the man responsible for that absence was sitting beside her on a terrace in the desert, holding her hand like it was the only real thing left in his world. The contradiction should have been clarifying. It should have sharpened her resolve, hardened her purpose, reminded her that every second of tenderness between them was built on a foundation of blood and bone and a dead man's unfinished whiskey. Instead, it blurred everything, because the hand holding hers was warm and the night was quiet, and the loneliness she saw in him was a mirror of her own, and mirrors don't lie even when the people standing in front of them do. She didn't pull away, and that was the beginning of the disaster. The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling. Cecile continued her mission. She had to. The stakes were too high, the debts too deep, but the lines she had drawn between operative and woman began to blur with alarming speed. She found herself listening to his stories not for intelligence but for understanding. She caught herself laughing at something he said genuinely, without calculation and the sound startled her because she couldn't remember the last time she had laughed without. Performing. He showed her parts of himself that no file, no briefing, no intelligence report had ever captured. The way he fed stray cats behind the compound kitchen at 4 in the round. Mourning, thinking no one saw. The way he read Korean poetry in his study with his glasses on, and his guard completely down, a different man entirely from the one who commanded a room of killers. The scar on his left side that he told her came from his father's belt buckle when he was 11, the night he fell asleep on the terrace beside her, and she watched his face in the moonlight and saw for the first time what he must have looked like as a boy before the world taught him to become a weapon. She called her handler less frequently. Her reports grew shorter. The intelligence still flowed, but Cecile noticed herself editing, omitting personal details, redacting moments that felt too private to transmit, protecting pieces of him she had no right to protect. Her handler noticed, during a secure call at 3 in the morning while Kyu-Bong slept, in the west wing, and the desert wind pressed against the estate windows like a living. The voice on the other end, a man named Olivier, her father's former second in command, the man who had raised her after Marcus Julian's murder, spoke with a sharpness she hadn't heard from him before. "You're losing focus, Cecile." "I'm not." "Your last 3 reports contained 0 personal intelligence on the target. No behavioral patterns. No emotional triggers. No vulnerability mapping. You're sending us logistics without context. That's not the mission." She stared at the desert through the terrace window. The moon was enormous, hanging low and swollen above the mountains, and the light it cast across the sand was the color of bone. "He's more complex than the briefing suggested," she said carefully. "He's a killer, Cecile. He murdered your father. He dismantled everything your family built. Complexity doesn't change that." Silence. "Don't fall in love with the mission," Olivier said quietly. "That's how operatives die." She ended the call and stood in the dark for a long time. Don't fall in love with the mission. It was the first rule of deep cover, the cardinal sin, the one mistake that turned assets into casualties and hunters into the hunted. She knew this. She had studied cases, operatives who had embedded too deeply, who had confused proximity with connection, who had allowed the performance of intimacy to become the thing itself. They all ended the same way, exposed, compromised, dead. And yet, one evening, he took her to the rooftop of the Crown Serpent after hours. The casino was closed below them, the lights of the strip painting the sky in neon. He stood behind her, his hands on the railing on either side of her body, his chest close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from him. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, breathing, his presence a gravitational force she could no longer pretend she didn't feel. "I have done terrible things," he said into the wind. His voice was barely audible, almost swallowed by the desert air. "Things that would make you run if you knew." "I know," she whispered. And she did. She knew every terrible thing documented in classified files, catalogued in her family's records of loss. She knew exactly what he was. "And you're still here." She closed her eyes. She felt his breath on the back of her neck, felt the impossible gravity of the moment pulling her toward a truth she couldn't afford to acknowledge. "I'm still here," she said. She didn't say I shouldn't be. She didn't say I'm here because I was sent to destroy you. She didn't say every moment I spend falling for you is a betrayal of everyone I've ever loved. She just stood there, on the rooftop of his empire, and let the war inside her rage. In silence, the city hummed beneath them, 40 stories of ambition and neon and darkness. And, for one suspended moment, the war didn't matter. The mission didn't matter. The dead didn't matter. There was only the heat of him behind her and the wind against her face. And the impossible, terrible fact that the most dangerous man she had ever met was Also the first person in years who had made her feel something other than the cold, calculated patience of revenge. That night, he kissed her for the first time. Or she kissed him. Later, she wouldn't be able to remember who moved first because it felt like both of them collapsing toward something inevitable, something that had been building since the moment she sat in that velvet chair with blood on the carpet and looked at him like he was simply a man. His hands cupped her face with a tenderness that contradicted every violent thing they had ever done, and when his lips met hers, she tasted scotch and salt and something. Desperate the hunger of a man who had been starving in a palace full of food. She kissed him back. Not as an operative, not as a Julian, as Cecile, and in that moment, standing on the roof of the empire she was meant to destroy, she became the most compromised agent in the history of her family's war. It was the most dangerous thing she had ever done, and it was the most honest. The gala was Kyu-Bong's annual display of dominance, a glittering, obscene affair. Held in the Crown Serpent's grand ballroom, attended by syndicate leaders, corrupt, politicians, arms dealers, and the kind of beautiful, dangerous people who moved through the world's shadows like fish through dark water. Everyone who mattered in the American underworld was there, dressed in black tie and false smiles, trading favors, and threats over champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Crystal. Chandeliers threw prismatic light across the room like shattered diamonds. A 12-piece orchestra played Chopin from a raised platform, the music elegant and cold, perfectly matched to the temperature of the room. Cecile dressed carefully that night. The deep crimson gown was floor-length, fitted at the waist, with a high slit that revealed a single leg when she walked. Her hair was up, exposing the full line of her neck and the subtle gold chain she wore, the only piece of jewelry that was truly hers, a gift from her father before he was killed. She applied her makeup with the precision of a woman arming herself, dark liner that sharpened her eyes, a deep burgundy lip, a touch of gold shimmer along her collarbone. She looked devastating. She looked like a weapon. Kyu-Bong stood at the entrance of the ballroom waiting for her, and when she appeared, at the top of the staircase, the room shifted. Conversations dimmed. Eyes turned. He had dressed to match her without knowing it. A black suit so dark it absorbed light, a crimson pocket square folded to a razor point, and beneath the open collar of his shirt, the serpent tattoo on his neck coiled toward his jaw like something alive. He watched her descend each step with the expression of a man watching a sunrise he believed had been created specifically for him. He offered his arm. She took it, and together they moved through the crowd like a matched set of blades, beautiful, gleaming, and lethal. The evening unfolded as planned. Cecile charmed lieutenants and politicians, cataloging faces and relationships, building the final pieces of the intelligence map she had been constructing for months. Kyu-Bong kept her close, his hand on the small of her back, possessive and proud, showing her off to his world like a crown jewel. She almost didn't see it coming. At 11:47, a man she didn't recognize brushed past her on the way to the friend bar. In the fraction of a second their bodies aligned, she felt something cold press against her hip, and in the same instant, she recognized the symbol tattooed on his wrist, a Julian family mark, one of her own. Her blood turned to ice. She hadn't authorized this. Olivier hadn't mentioned any secondary operation. Someone in the Julian chain of command, impatient, reckless, acting without her knowledge, had sent a triggerman into the most heavily surveilled event in the American underworld. Time crystallized. The man's hand moved toward the inside of his jacket. His eyes were locked on Kyu-Bong's back. Cecile's training took over before her heart could catch up. She grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it downward, and in a single fluid motion, redirected his body into a waiter carrying a tray of champagne glasses. Crystal shattered across the marble floor. The crowd gasped. Security materialized from every corner. but the damage was already done. In the commotion, the man's jacket fell open, revealing a holstered weapon and a secondary blade strapped to his chest. Kyu-Bong's head of security tackled him to the ground. And in the chaos that followed the shouting, the drawn weapons, the guests, scattering Kyu-Bong's intelligence chief, a cold-eyed man named Park Sung-min who had spent 30 years reading lies the way other people read newspapers, did 3 things very quickly. He searched the would-be assassin. He found a coded communication device, and he traced the encryption signature to a network that had been flagged in Kyu-Bong's files. For over a decade, the ghost frequency of the Julian syndicate. Cecile stood in the center of the ballroom, champagne soaking the hem of her crimson gown, and watched Sang-min's face change as the pieces connected. She watched him, look at the assassin, then at the device, then at her. She watched the recognition bloom, in his eyes like something poisonous, and she knew with the cold, absolute certainty of a chess player watching the board collapse that the game was over. Sang-min crossed the ballroom and whispered in Kyu-Bong's ear. The room kept moving. Music resumed. Guests returned to their conversations with the practiced indifference of people accustomed to violence interrupting their evenings, but Cecile stood motionless, watching Kyu-Bong's profile from across the room, watching the Whisperland, watching his body go rigid, not with anger, not yet, with something worse, with understanding. He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was unlike anything she had ever seen from him. It wasn't rage. It was devastation. Total, obliterating devastation, the expression of a man watching the only beautiful thing in his life reveal itself as a lie. His dark eyes, usually so controlled, so predatory, were wide and raw and shattered, and for one terrible, suspended moment, she saw the boy behind the monster, the boy who had learned early that everything he loved would eventually betray him. Then the devastation hardened, his jaw set, his eyes narrowed, the vulnerability sealed itself behind something impenetrable and ancient and violent, and the man, standing across the ballroom from her, was no longer the person who had held her hand on the terrace and admitted he was lonely. He was something else, something she had always known was there but had let herself forget. "Everyone out," he said. His voice carried across the room like a blade drawn across. Stone, quiet, absolute, and final. The room emptied in under 2 minutes. Only his lieutenants remained, 6 men in, black suits forming a loose perimeter around the ballroom, and Cecile, standing alone. In the center of the marble floor, champagne still dripping from her gown, her heart hammering beneath her ribs with a force that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the unbearable weight of what she had done. Kyu-Bong walked toward her slowly. Each footstep echoed. He stopped 3 feet away. "Julian," he said. Just the name, her real name, and the way he said it like a wound, like a confession, like a prayer to a god who had abandoned him, broke something in, both of them that would never heal. "Kyu-Bong, listen to me." "Julian," he said it again, harder this time, the syllables grinding against each other like teeth. "Marcus, Julian's daughter, the man I killed in Queens, the family I erased." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "They sent you. They sent you to me like a gift, and I opened it. I opened it with both hands." He laughed, a short, brittle sound that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with a man watching his own sanity crack in real time. "Were any of it real?" he asked. His voice cracked on the last word, and the crack was worse than any violence he could have inflicted, because it was honest, stripped. The question of a man who already knew the answer but needed to hear her say it. She opened her mouth, and the truth, the real, devastating, mission-compromising truth was yes. Yes, parts of it were real. The laughter was real. The hand on the terrace was real. The kiss on the rooftop was real. The woman who had watched him sleep and seen the boy inside the monster she was real. But Cecile couldn't say that, because saying it would mean the mission was a failure, that she had betrayed her family's memory, that every person who died in the Julian Syndicate's war against Kyu-Bong had died for nothing. So she said nothing, and her silence was the cruelest answer of all. Kyu-Bong did not sleep that night. He sat in the study of his estate, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he had smashed: crystal decanters, a glass table framed, photographs, a mirror that had reflected a face he no longer recognized, and he drank scotch straight from the bottle, while Park Sang-min laid out the full intelligence report in a flat, clinical voice that made every revelation sound like an autopsy. Cecile Julian, daughter of Marcus Julian, the former head of the Julian crime family, murdered 9 years ago in a coordinated hit ordered by Kyu-Bong himself. Trained, operative, deep cover specialist, inserted into his casino on a reconnaissance mission to map his financial infrastructure, security protocols, and personnel hierarchy. Duration of insertion: 4 months. Intelligence transmitted: comprehensive. Sang-min placed photographs on the desk: surveillance images, family records, a grainy shot of a teenage Cecile standing beside her father at a gathering that Kyu-Bong's people had photographed years before the Julian purge. She looked different in it. Younger, softer. Her eyes were bright with the kind of innocence that only survives in people who haven't yet learned what the world costs. Looking at that photograph, at the girl she had been before he destroyed her world, Kyu-Bong felt something buckle inside him. Not guilt. He wasn't built for guilt, but a terrible, howling recognition. He had created her. The woman he loved was a weapon forged in the fire of his own violence, aimed directly at his heart, and she had hit her mark with devastating precision. Every word was a blade. Every fact was a scar. Kyu-Bong listened without speaking, his tattooed hands wrapped around the bottle, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on a point. In the middle distance that only he could see, the alcohol did nothing. The rage did nothing. There was a pain beneath both that was older and deeper than either could reach: the pain of a man who had allowed himself, for the first time in decades, to believe that someone could look at him and see something worth loving, and that belief had been engineered, manufactured, weaponized against him by the daughter of a man he had killed. When Sang-min finished his report, a silence filled the study like water filling a sinking vessel. "Where is she?" Kyu-Bong asked. His voice was unrecognizable, low, hoarse, stripped of everything human. "Still in the East Wing, under guard. She hasn't attempted to lock it, lock everything. No one enters the compound, no one leaves the city." Sang-min hesitated. "Sir, locking down the entire city will attract federal—" "I said lock it." And he did. Within 2 hours, every exit point Kyu-Bong's network controlled. Highways, private airstrips, docks, even train stations was sealed by his people. Checkpoints materialized on roads that had never seen them before. Private jets at Henderson Executive Airport were grounded on his orders. 2 of the city's most prominent hotel managers received phone calls at 4 a.m. from men with dead voices, informing them that any guest matching Cecile Julian's description was to be reported immediately. The Las Vegas underworld ground to a halt as his enforcers moved through every district, every safe house, every back channel, tearing apart his own infrastructure, looking for anyone connected to the Julian name. Allies were interrogated. Business partners were threatened. 3 of his own men suspected of harboring Julian sympathizers were dragged from their homes at 3 a.m. and brought to the compound's basement. The city that Kyu-Bong had spent a decade building into his personal dominion became, overnight, a prison not for Cecile, who was already caged, but for everyone in it. Business owners who had nothing to do with the Julian family found their establishments searched by armed men. Low-level soldiers who had been loyal for years were pulled from their posts and interrogated for hours over connections that didn't exist. The fear was contagious and indiscriminate, spreading through Kyu-Bong's organization like a virus, and the virus was his own paranoia, multiplied by grief, amplified by rage, and distributed through every chain of command in his empire. He was unraveling, and the worst part was that he knew it. He could feel himself breaking apart, could feel the obsession that had made him powerful curdling into something toxic and uncontrollable. But he couldn't stop, because stopping meant accepting the loss. And the loss was not just Cecile, it was the illusion of her, the woman who had looked at him like a man, the silence on the terrace, the hand in his, all of it gone, all of it poisoned, and the void left behind was so massive that the only thing he could think to do was fill it with violence. He went to the east wing at dawn. The guards parted. He opened the door and found Cecile sitting on the edge of the bed, still wearing the crimson gown, her hair undone, her face bare of makeup, her eyes red from something she would never admit was grief. She looked up at him, and he saw it the same devastation he carried, reflected back at him from the face of the woman who had caused it. "You will not leave this compound," he said. "You will not contact your people. You will not speak to anyone without my permission. You are mine, Cecile. You were always mine. The only thing that's changed is that now I know what you are." She stood slowly. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her. "You can't keep me in a cage, Kyu-Bong. Watch me." He turned and left. The door locked behind him with a sound that echoed through the estate like a gunshot, and Cecile stood alone in the room, her father's gold chain still hanging from her neck, and felt the walls close in around her like a fist. Over the next week, Kyu-Bong's descent accelerated with terrifying velocity. He interrogated his own lieutenants, accusing men who had served him faithfully for decades of conspiring with the Julian family. 2 were beaten badly enough to require medical attention. 1 disappeared entirely. The compound became a pressure cooker of fear and paranoia, with Kyu-Bong at its center, pacing the halls at all hours, his eyes bloodshot, his suit jacket discarded, his white shirt stained with scotch and something darker. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping for more than an hour at a time. The tattoos on his chest and neck seemed to pulse with a life of their own as he moved through the shadows of his own empire, tearing it apart from the inside like a man trying to claw his way out of his own skin. His business operations began to hemorrhage. Shipments were missed because the men responsible for coordinating them were too terrified to make decisions without Kyu-Bong's explicit approval, and Kyu-Bong was too consumed by his personal crisis to approve anything. A weapons deal with a Mexican cartel collapsed when Kyu-Bong failed to attend the meeting. A money laundering pipeline through 3 Las Vegas. Hotels stalled because he had pulled the accountants from their posts to cross-reference every financial record for Julian connections. His empire was a machine, and he was ripping out its gears one by one, holding each up to the light to search for rust. His remaining lieutenants began to whisper among themselves carefully, in coded glances and conversations held in parking garages far from the compounds. Microphones. They had followed Kyu-Bong through wars, through betrayals, through federal investigations that would have broken lesser men. But this was different. There wasn't a leader under siege. This was a leader at war with himself and the collateral. Damage was everyone around him. Joan Tae-sik, the quiet lieutenant whose daughter's medical bills Kyu-Bong's organization covered, stood in the compound's security room one night watching the camera feeds cycle through empty hallways. On one screen, he could see Kyu-Bong sitting alone in the dining room at 2 a.m, a bottle of scotch in front of him, talking to the empty chair where Cecile used to sit. On another screen, he could see the east wing door locked, guarded, sealed like a tomb. He looked at both images for a long time and said nothing, but he remembered the name Cecile Julian, and he filed it. Away in a place where patient men keep dangerous information. And through it all, Kyu-Bong returned to her. Every night, sometimes 2 or 3 times, standing in the doorway of the East Wing with eyes that flickered between rage and anguish, saying nothing, just looking at her as if the answer to every question that had ever tormented him was written on her face, and he couldn't read the language. Cecile watched him deteriorate and felt something she hadn't expected not. Satisfaction. Not triumph, but sorrow. This was what she had been sent to do. This was the mission's endgame, to infiltrate, destabilize, and destroy. And it was working. Kyu-Bong was destroying himself, just as her handlers had predicted. But they hadn't predicted that she would feel this way watching it happen. They hadn't predicted that the weapon would develop a conscience, that the spy would grieve for the king she was, built to dethrone. She thought about Olivier's warning, don't fall in love with the mission, and almost laughed at the bitter inadequacy of it. This wasn't love. Love was clean. Love had borders. What she felt for Kyu-Bong was something murkier and more violent than love. It was empathy entangled with hatred, tenderness poisoned by vengeance, the impossible coexistence of wanting to save someone and needing to destroy them. It was the worst feeling she had ever experienced, and it was entirely her own fault. On the 9th night, he came to her room and sat on the floor with his back against the calm wall. He looked like a ruin of the man she had met, gaunt, unshaven, the sharp cheekbones now hollow, the dark eyes sunken and feverish. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. "I would have given you everything," he whispered. "If you had been real, I would have burned the whole world down and rebuilt it for you." Cecile sat on the bed above him and looked down at the wreckage of a man who had once terrified nations, and she said the only true thing she had left. "Part of me was real." He closed his eyes. A single tear ran down his face and disappeared into the dark ink on his neck. Then his expression hardened again, the vulnerability sealing over like skin, closing over a wound, and when he opened his eyes, the man on the floor was gone. The monster had returned. "Then that part," he said, "is the part I'll keep, even if I have to carve it out of you." He stood and left, and Cecile knew, with the absolute clarity of a soldier who has run out of options, that if she didn't escape in the next 48 hours, she never would. Kyu-Bong was no longer operating on logic. He was operating on obsession, and obsession had no ceiling and no floor. He would keep her locked in this compound until one of them was dead, and the way things were going, she wasn't sure which of them it would be. The compound was a fortress, but every fortress had weaknesses she had spent months cataloging them. The camera blind spot behind the kitchen, the 30-second gap during the southeast guard rotation at 3:17 a.m., the drainage tunnel beneath the car, east garden that connected to a storm runoff system, 300 meters beyond the perimeter wall. She had mapped it all during her espionage, never thinking she would need it for herself. Now it was the only thing standing between her and a cage that would never open. She reached beneath the mattress and pulled out a micro-transmitter she had hidden. There during her first week, a last resort device, single use, with enough range to reach the Julian network's nearest relay point. She pressed the button, 3 short pulses, the extraction code, somewhere across the city, in a rented apartment above a laundromat on East Charleston Boulevard. A receiver blinked 3 times in the darkness. A man she had never met picked up a phone and began making calls. Gears that had been oiled and positioned years ago began to turn. People who had been waiting in silence began to move. The Julian syndicate was a ghost, but ghosts, Cecile knew, were just the dead who refused to stay dead, and she was her father's daughter. Then she sat in the darkness, still wearing the gold chain her father had given her, and waited for the war to begin. If Cecile and Kyu-Bong's story has you on the edge of your seat, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell, because the escape, the 5-year silence, and the revenge, that's all coming next, and it's going to be insane. Comment below. Team Cecile or Team Kyu-Bong? Drop your flag and where you're watching from. Don't miss what happens next. The queen is about to steal the king's crown. See you in the next one. The extraction came on the 11th night, at exactly 3:14 a.m. 3 minutes before. The southeast guard rotation gap she had memorized months ago, when she was still pretending to be a woman who wandered the gardens for the scent of night blooming. Jasmine rather than a spy, mapping every crack in her captor's fortress. Cecile had not slept. She sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness of the east wing, fully dressed in black, a fitted long-sleeve top, dark trousers, flat-soled shoes she had, hidden beneath the floorboards of the walk-in closet during her second week in the round compound. Her hair was pulled back tight, every curl pinned and controlled, and the gold chain from her father was tucked inside her collar, pressed flat against her sternum, where it couldn't catch the light or snag on anything. She had removed the crimson clothes, the gold earrings, the bracelet he had given her on their first night. She had stripped herself of everything Kyu-Bong had dressed her in, every piece of silk and gold that marked her as his possession, and what remained was the woman underneath, lean, precise, and lethal. At 3:12, the first explosion detonated. It was small, a shaped charge planted inside the generator housing on the compound's north perimeter, positioned to sever the primary power feed without igniting the fuel reserves. The blast shook the windows of the east wing and plunged the estate into total darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in 4 seconds later, red, dim, insufficient, and in those 4 seconds of pure black, Cecile moved. She crossed the suite in 3 strides, opened the terrace door, and dropped from the part-con second-floor balcony to the garden below. The fall was 12 feet. She rolled on. Impact, absorbing the force through her shoulders and hips the way she had been, taught in the Julian family's training compound in upstate New York when she was pawned, 17, back when Olivier still believed she was too young for field work, and she had to prove him wrong by breaking her collarbone on a practice jump and getting back up without making a sound. The garden was chaos. Guards were shouting. Flashlight beams swept the grounds in. Erratic arcs. The generator explosion had triggered every alarm in the compound, and Kyu-Bong's security team was responding exactly the way she had predicted flooding. The north perimeter, pulling men from the south and east posts to reinforce what they assumed was a breach point. It wasn't a breach. It was a distraction, and they were running toward it like moths toward a flame she had designed specifically to blind them. She moved south, through the hedge line that bordered the ornamental garden, crouching low, the branches scratching at her arms and face like fingers trying to hold her back, past the kitchen annex, where a cook who worked the overnight shift stood in. The doorway smoking a cigarette and staring toward the explosion site, his back to her, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his shoulder. She held her breath, flattened herself against the stone wall, and waited until he flicked the cigarette into the gravel and went inside. 3 seconds. 3 seconds between detection and invisibility. She moved again. She slipped through the camera blind spot she had identified on her 5th day in the compound, a 3-meter gap between camera 7 and camera 8, where the angles didn't overlap because a decorative pillar blocked the sightline. She had reported this vulnerability in one of her early transmissions to the Julian network, never imagining she would use it herself. Now it was the difference between captivity and freedom. The drainage tunnel entrance was exactly where her map said it would be, a concrete hatch beneath a stone bench in the southeast garden, concealed by ivy that had been growing over it for years. She pulled the ivy aside, wrenched the hatch open, and dropped into darkness. The tunnel was narrow, damp, and pitch black, She moved by touch, one hand on the curved concrete wall, counting her steps the way she had counted cards at Kyu-Bong's poker table precisely, automatically, without emotion. 312. Steps to the junction. Left turn. Another 140 steps to the runoff grate. Her breathing was controlled. Her heartbeat was elevated but manageable. She was functioning on training and adrenaline, and the cold, clear knowledge that if she stopped moving, she would die in this tunnel, and no one would ever find her, and the Julian name would end in darkness beneath a dead man's garden. At step 207, she heard voices above her, muffled by concrete and soil but unmistakable. Kyu-Bong's men sweeping the grounds, their boots crunching. On gravel, their radios crackling with the static hiss of coordinated panic. Someone shouted about the east wing. Someone else responded with a code she recognized, a lockdown protocol she had documented in her 3rd week at the compound. They were sealing the perimeter, searching room by room. It would take them minutes to discover. Her bed was empty, and then every man in the compound would converge on the one place she couldn't afford to be, between the walls and the world. She moved faster. Her hand scraped against something jagged on the tunnel wall, an exposed bolt or a broken seam in the concrete, and she felt the skin on her palm tear open. Warm blood ran between her fingers. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Stopping was a luxury that belonged to people who had time, and time was the one currency she was spending faster than she could count. She reached the runoff grate at 3:21, 7 minutes since the explosion. The grate was rusted but not locked, a maintenance oversight she had noted and never reported, keeping it as insurance. She kicked it twice, and it swung open on corroded hinges, revealing a scrubby desert hillside and a sky full of stars. A black SUV sat idling 200 meters down the slope, headlights off, engine running. Julian operatives. The extraction team Olivier had positioned the moment her signal was received. 2 men and a woman, all former special forces, all recruited into the Julian network during the years of silence when the syndicate existed as nothing more than a whisper and a promise. They had been parked on this desert road for 48 hours, sleeping in shifts, waiting for a signal they weren't sure would ever come. Cecile scrambled down the hillside, gravel sliding beneath her feet, her torn palm leaving dark smears on every rock she grabbed for balance. She reached the vehicle in under a minute. The rear door opened. She threw herself inside. The driver, a woman named Kira, with steady hands and no questions, accelerated before the door was fully closed, tires biting into the desert road, and within 30 seconds the compound was a shrinking constellation of red emergency lights in the rearview mirror. The man in the passenger seat handed her a medical kit without speaking. She wrapped her bleeding palm with gauze, tying it off with her teeth, her hands shaking for the first time all night, not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming physiological crash of an adrenaline response that had been sustaining her for the past 12 minutes and was now releasing its grip. She was out. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and closed her eyes. And for exactly 4 seconds, she allowed herself to feel the full, annihilating weight of what she had just done. She had escaped. She had survived. She was free. And she had left him alive. That was the part that would haunt her. Not the tunnel. Not the explosion. Not the desperate scramble down a dark hillside in the middle of the Nevada desert. The fact that she could have ended it, could have slipped a blade between his ribs on anyone. Of those 9 nights he came to her room and sat on the floor with his back against the wall, a broken man offering his exposed throat to the woman who had broken him. She could have ended the war right there. Olivier would have called it justice. Her father's ghost would have called it necessary. But she hadn't. Because the part of her that was real, the part he had said he wanted to carve out and keep that part, couldn't kill a man who had held her hand on a Terrace and told her she made the silence bearable. So she left him alive. And that mercy, she knew, would cost her. It would cost her years. Behind her, in the compound, Kyu-Bong reached the east wing at 3:29, he had heard. The explosion from the west wing, where he had been sitting in the dark staring at nothing, and had moved through the chaos of his own compound with the mechanical fury of a man whose worst nightmare was confirming itself in real time, he shoved past. Guards. He shouldered through a locked door that hadn't been opened because no one had the authority to override his security protocols without his direct order. He reached her room. It was empty. The bed was made. The crimson clothes hung in the closet, untouched. The bracelet he had sent her sat on the vanity table, coiled like a dead snake. The gold earrings were beside it. Everything he had given her, returned. The only thing missing was her and the gold chain she wore around her neck, the one piece of jewelry that had never been his. He stood in the doorway of the empty room for a long time. His men were shouting behind him, reporting the generator breach, the perimeter sweep, the discovery of the drainage tunnel. He heard none of it. He stood in the room that still smelled faintly of amber and smoke, and looked at the bracelet on the vanity table and felt something inside him collapse so completely that the sound it made was silence. He walked to the bed. The sheets were cold. He pressed his hand against the pillow, where her head had rested, and held it there as if checking for a pulse. Then he walked to the closet. The crimson suits hung in a row. The crimson, the black, the gold. Every piece of armor he had chosen for her, still carrying the ghost shape of her body in, the way the fabric hung from the hangers. He touched one sleeve. The silk was cool, beneath his tattooed fingers. He closed his eyes and breathed in, and caught, faintly, the last trace of her perfume, trapped in the fibers, amber and smoke, and something that smelled like endings. Then he screamed. It was not a word. It was not a name. It was a sound pulled from somewhere beneath. Language, beneath thought, beneath the architecture of a man who had spent his entire life constructing himself into something indestructible. The scream tore through the compound like a blade through silk, and every man who heard it, hardened soldiers, veteran enforcers, men who had witnessed torture and murder without flinching, felt something cold settle in the base of their spines. Kyu-Bong stood in Cecile Julian's empty room, surrounded by the ghost of her, perfume, and the evidence of her absence, and understood with absolute, devastating clarity that the only person who had ever made him feel human had just proved that he was a fool. He picked up the bracelet from the vanity, held it in his fist, squeezed until the gold bit into his palm, and drew blood, his blood mixing with hers on the skin of a hand that had held hers on a terrace under stars that suddenly looked like the scattered debris of something detonated. He wanted to destroy the bracelet. He wanted to hurl it through the window, flush it, melt it down. Instead, he slipped it into his pocket and stood there, bleeding, breathing, alone in a room that still echoed with the shape of a woman who was already miles away and moving fast. He did not recover from that night. Not really. Not ever. 5 years passed. 5 years in which the name Cecile Julian became a curse, whispered in the halls of Kyu-Bong's organization, a ghost story told by lieutenants to new recruits as a warning about the cost of letting outsiders past the gates. 5 years in which Kyu-Bong rebuilt. The walls she had breached, tripled his security detail, installed surveillance systems so comprehensive that even his own men felt watched, because they were, 5 years in, which he ruled his empire with an iron fist wrapped around a glass of scotch, erratic and brilliant and terrifying, a king slowly poisoned by the memory of a queen who had never existed. He developed rituals that his lieutenants learned not to question. Every Tuesday he reviewed the intelligence report on Julian sightings, always empty, always nothing. but he read every page as if the words themselves might rearrange into her location if he stared at them long enough. He kept the east wing of the compound sealed. No one entered. No one cleaned. The orchids died and were not replaced. The room became a mausoleum not for a dead woman, but for the dead version of himself that had been capable of vulnerability, and he preserved it the way some men preserve battlefields, as a monument to the precise moment everything went wrong. He drank more, slept less. The meetings with his lieutenants, once crisp and decisive, became unpredictable sometimes. He was the old Kyu-Bong, sharp and calculating, and 3 steps ahead, and other times he drifted mid-sentence into silences that lasted minutes, staring at something no one else in the room could see. His men adapted. They learned to wait out the silences, to answer questions he hadn't asked, to manage the operations that kept his empire running while their boss fought a private war against a ghost. The Crown Serpent Casino was renovated. The VIP floor where they had first met was gutted and redesigned. New carpets, new furniture, new chandeliers, as if by removing every physical trace of her presence, he could scrub her from his neural pathways the way his cleaners scrubbed blood from marble. It didn't work. He could renovate every room in every building he owned, and she would still be sitting in that velvet chair with whiskey in her hand and a smirk on her lips, looking at him like he was simply a man. She lived in his memory the way a scar lives in the body healed over. On the surface, permanent underneath, aching when the weather changed. His paranoia deepened. He trusted no one completely, vetted every new associate with a thoroughness that bordered on pathological, and maintained a private intelligence unit whose sole purpose was tracking any mention of the Julian name anywhere in the world. Sang Min, his intelligence chief, ran the unit with characteristic precision, but even he acknowledged privately that the trail had gone cold. Cecile Julian had vanished, not into hiding, into absence. She had erased herself so completely from the world's surface that even the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus on the continent couldn't find a fingerprint, a transaction, a single digital shadow. But she hadn't disappeared. She had descended, below the surface of every system. Kyu-Bong monitored. Cecile was building. In the first year after her escape, she moved through 3 countries under 4 different identities, never staying in one city longer than 6 weeks. She let the bruises heal. The physical ones from the compound escape, and the internal ones that were slower and more stubborn. She cut her hair short. She stopped wearing crimson. She became someone new, or rather, she became the person she had always been beneath the disguise she wore for Kyu-Bong. Cold, calculating, patient, and driven by a purpose that no longer had room for sentiment. There were nights in anonymous hotel rooms in Lisbon and Osaka and Cape Town, when she would wake at 3 a.m. with the phantom weight of his hand on hers, and she would lie in the dark and wait for the sensation to pass the way you wait. For a cramp to release, it always passed, but it never fully disappeared. She carried him, with her the way soldiers carry shrapnel embedded, invisible, aching at odd moments. A permanent souvenir of a war she had barely survived. She channeled it. The pain, the guilt, the confused grief of a woman who had loved the wrong person, for reasons that were both strategically catastrophic and profoundly human. She compressed all of it into fuel, into focus, into the single-minded determination of a woman who would not rest until the man who had caged her was standing in a cage of her own construction, and this time she would be the one holding the key. The severance happened in a hotel room in Tokyo, 14 months after the escape. She was sitting on the floor with a cup of cold tea, reviewing a dossier on Kyu-Bong's Macau operations, when she turned a page and found a surveillance photograph of him, recent, taken outside the Crown Serpent at night. He looked gaunt, diminished. His suit hanging loosely on a frame that had lost weight it couldn't afford to lose. And for One unguarded moment. She felt the old pull, the gravity of him, the want, the impossible tenderness that had almost killed her. She stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she turned it face down, placed both palms flat on the floor, and made a decision not with her heart, which still ached, but with the part of her that was older and harder than her heart, the part that had watched her father's coffin lowered into the ground and had sworn, silently, that his death would not be the end of the Julian story. She would not love Kyu-Bong anymore. She would not allow it. She would take that love, apart the way a soldier field strips a weapon piece by piece, methodically, until what remained was not love, but machinery. And she would use that machinery to destroy him. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. Harder than the tunnel. Harder than the escape. But she did it. And when it was done, she picked up the dossier and continued. Reading. And the woman who set the photograph face down. And the woman who resumed. The work were not entirely the same person. Olivier debriefed her in a safe house in Montreal 2 months after the escape. He was older than she remembered the years of running a ghost syndicate from the shadows, had carved lines into his face that hadn't been there when her father was alive. He sat across from her at a scarred wooden table and listened to her full operational report, without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The intelligence you gathered is extraordinary, he said finally. We have more actionable data on Kyu-Bong's operation than any agency, any rival, any law enforcement body on Earth. You gave us everything. Not everything, she said. I left him alive. Olivier studied her face. Was that strategic or personal? She didn't answer. And Olivier, who had raised her since she was 19 and knew her silences better than most people knew words, didn't press. What do you want to do now? He asked. She looked at him, and in her eyes, dark, steady, depthless, he saw something he hadn't seen since the night Marcus Julian was murdered. Not grief, not rage, something older and more dangerous than both. Resolution. I don't want to dismantle his empire, she said quietly. I want to take it. I want to sit in his chair. Olivier leaned back. A long exhale. Then, slowly, a nod. Then we build, he said. And they did. Slowly, methodically, with the patience of people who had been playing the long game since before the world knew they were still alive. The Julian Syndicate had been declared dead by every intelligence agency and rival organization on the continent. Its territories were absorbed. Its assets were seized. Its name was removed from the power rankings of the American underworld as thoroughly as if it had been redacted from history. What no one understood was that this erasure was itself a weapon. You cannot target what doesn't exist. You cannot defend against an enemy that the world has agreed is already dead. The Julians didn't survive by hiding. They survived by becoming invisible, and invisibility, in a world obsessed with spectacle and display, was the ultimate strategic advantage. Cecile used it ruthlessly. She began in the margins, acquiring small businesses in cities where Kyu-Bong's influence was weakest. A shipping company in Houston, a chain of laundromats in Atlanta that laundered more than clothes, a construction firm in Detroit that bid on the same city contracts Kyu-Bong's shell companies used for money laundering. None of these acquisitions were large enough to draw attention. None of them bore any connection to the Julian name. They were registered under layers of holding companies, trusts, and legal entities so dense that tracing them back to Cecile would have required a forensic accountant with a decade of free time and a death wish. By the second year, she had a network. By the third, she had an infrastructure. By the fourth, she had something that Kyu-Bong, for all his power, all his surveillance, all his obsessive vigilance, had never imagined possible. a shadow empire that existed in the negative space of his own, occupying every gap, every blind spot, every overlooked margin of his vast criminal apparatus, like water seeping through cracks in a dam. And then she began to drain him. It started with his accountant in Macau. The man's name was Lim Dae-hyun, and he had managed the Asian pipeline of Kyu-Bong's money laundering operation for 11 years. He was meticulous, loyal, and deeply boring, the kind of man who ate the same lunch every day and drove the same car for a decade. He was also in catastrophic debt from his wife's cancer treatments, a codamone fact he had hidden from the organization for 3 years by skimming interest payments from dormant accounts. It was a small crime, the kind that might have been forgiven by a reasonable boss. But Kyu-Bong, in his current state, was not a reasonable boss. Kyu-Bong was a man who saw betrayal in every shadow, and if he discovered Lim's skimming, the punishment would not be financial. It would be final. Cecile knew this because she had catalogued Lim's vulnerability 5 years ago, sitting in a walk-in closet in Kyu-Bong's estate, photographing files with a button camera. She had filed it away in the vault of her memory, alongside dozens of other pressure points, waiting for the day she would need them. That day had come. The approach was indirect. A woman Lim had never met one of Cecile's operatives, a Korean-American financial analyst named Soo-yeon, who had been embedded in Macau's banking sector for 2 years, began frequenting the same dim sum restaurant where Lim ate lunch. Over the course of 3 months, they became acquaintances. Over the next 2, something approaching friends. Soo-yeon never asked about his work. She never pushed. She simply existed in his routine, a warm and uncomplicated presence in a life defined by secrets and fear. When Lim finally confided in her about his debts, 3 glasses of baijiu deep on a rainy Tuesday, Soo-yeon offered a solution. Not Kyu-Bong's solution, which was silence and terror. A different kind of solution. A way to clear his debts, protect his wife, and keep his position in exchange for cooperation. Quiet cooperation. The kind that looked, from the outside, exactly like loyalty. Lim agreed. And just like that, Cecile owned the man who controlled the flow of Kyu-Bong's money through Asia. She repeated this pattern with surgical precision across Kyu-Bong's organization, adapting her approach to each target's specific vulnerability. For the lieutenant with the gambling addiction, she arranged for his debts to be purchased by a collection agency she controlled, then offered relief in exchange for information on shipment schedules. For the captain who was sleeping with a rival's wife, she provided protection from exposure, and in return, he began subtly rerouting supply chains to favor companies Cecile secretly owned, for John Tae-sik, the quiet lieutenant whose daughter needed medical treatment. The approach was the most delicate. Cecile arranged for the girl to be accepted into a clinical trial at Johns Hopkins, funded by a medical foundation that existed on paper and in Tae-sik's gratitude, and nowhere else. She never rushed. She never overreached. She took one piece at a time, the way a patient chess player removes pawns before ever threatening the king, and each piece she took weakened the structure without changing its appearance. From the outside, Kyu-Bong's empire looked exactly the same, vast, feared, unassailable. From the inside, it was hollowing out like a tree eaten by termites, still standing, still green at the crown, but one strong wind away from collapse. The brilliance of her strategy was its ordinariness. She didn't orchestrate dramatic heists or spectacular betrayals. She orchestrated mundane, invisible shifts, a percentage point here, a personnel change there, a contract renegotiation that favored a supplier she secretly owned. Each individual action was so small, so unremarkable, that it disappeared into the background noise of a large criminal organization's daily operations. But together, accumulated over months and years with the relentless patience of erosion wearing down stone, They constituted the most sophisticated hostile takeover in the history of the American underworld. She kept a ledger not digital, not stored on any server or drive, but written in a leather-bound notebook in a cipher she had invented herself, a language of symbols, and abbreviations that only she could read. In it, she tracked every asset acquired, every operative turned, every dollar redirected, every vulnerability exploited. The ledger grew thick over the years, its pages dense with the architecture of a slow-motion coup. She kept it in a fireproof safe in an apartment in Brooklyn that existed under a name no one had ever heard of, in a building owned by a trust administered by a law firm that didn't know who its real client was. Layers upon layers upon layers. She had learned from the best from Kyu-Bong himself, who had taught her, without knowing it, that true power is invisible, and the moment people can see your strength is the moment they begin planning how to take it. The money was the most elegant part. Cecile didn't steal it that would have triggered alarms. Instead, she redirected it. Lim, now operating under her direction, began routing Kyu-Bong's laundered funds through new intermediary accounts that appeared legitimate, but charged fractionally higher processing fees that were siphoned into holding companies Cecile controlled. The amounts were microscopic, fractions of percentages, pennies on every dollar, but Kyu-Bong's operation moved. Hundreds of millions annually, and fractions of hundreds of millions, accumulated over months and then years, became a river of capital flowing silently out of his empire and into hers. His front businesses began to fail, one by one, in ways that looked like market forces, rather than sabotage. A nightclub chain lost its liquor licenses due to health code violations reported by an inspector whose daughter attended the same private school as one of Cecile's operatives. A real estate development stalled when zoning permits were revoked by a city councilwoman who owed Cecile a favor she didn't even know was a favor. A casino in Atlantic City hemorrhaged customers when a competing establishment opened 2 blocks away, a competing establishment funded by a holding company that traced back through 9 layers of incorporation to a woman who no longer wore crimson and no longer existed on any database in the world. And through it all, Kyu-Bong raged at the darkness without ever seeing the hand in it. He blamed market downturns. He blamed incompetent lieutenants. He blamed federal interference, rival syndicates, bad luck. He fired accountants, replaced managers, restructured entire divisions of his operation, and each time he did, Cecile's people were there to fill the gaps, embedding themselves deeper into the organism of his empire like antibodies that had learned to mimic the disease. By the 5th year, she owned 40% of his financial infrastructure. She controlled or influenced 6 of his 11 remaining lieutenants, including 4 of the 6 he considered his innermost circle. She held the debts on 3 of his 4 flagship properties. Henri Kyu-Bong sitting in his penthouse above the crown. Serpent, staring at financial reports that showed declining revenues and rising costs, and a slow, inexplicable erosion of everything he had built, had no idea that the woman he hadn't been able to find for half a decade was not hiding from him. She was standing directly behind him, so close he could have felt her breath if he had known where to. Look, it was time. The first sign was a photograph. It appeared on Kyu-Bong's desk at the Crown Serpent on a Tuesday morning in October, a morning that had started like every other morning in the 5th year of his slow, unacknowledged decline. He had woken at 4, as he always did, from a dream. He could never fully remember, but that left the taste of whiskey and perfume in his mouth. He had dressed in the dark. He had driven to the casino in a convoy of black SUVs. Surrounded by bodyguards he no longer bothered to learn the names of. He had sat in his office and reviewed financial reports that Lim Dae-hyun had prepared with meticulous care, reports that showed exactly what Cecile wanted them to show, a Slow bleed dressed as normal market contraction, a carefully managed decline that was just gradual enough to be plausible and just persistent enough to be devastating. And then he saw the photograph, placed on his desk by someone who had access to his private office, which meant someone inside his innermost circle. The photograph showed a woman sitting in a cafe in Paris, taken from across the street with a long lens. She was in profile, her face partially obscured by sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat. But the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck, the way she held her coffee cup left hand, always left hand, the right one resting on the table as if ready to reach for. Something was unmistakable. Cecile. Kyu-Bong held the photograph with both hands and stared at it for 11 minutes, without moving. Sang-min, standing on the other side of the desk, watched his boss's face cycle through a sequence of expressions that would have been fascinating to a psychiatrist and terrifying to anyone else. Shock, hunger, rage, grief, and then something beneath all of them, something that had never fully extinguished despite 5 years of darkness and scotch and sleepless nights. Want. Pure, undiluted, pathological. Want. When was this taken? Kyu-Bong's voice was hoarse, as if the question had scraped against something raw on its way out. The metadata says 3 days ago. We're verifying. Find her. Sir, this could be. Find her. Sang-min, who had survived in Kyu-Bong's organization longer than anyone by knowing when to argue and when to obey, bowed his head and left the office. Over the next 2 weeks, a trail materialized not suddenly, not obviously, but with the deliberate, breadcrumb by breadcrumb pacing of someone who wanted to be followed, but didn't want it to look easy. A financial transaction in Zurich linked to a dormant Julian family account. A hotel registration in Dubai under a name that anagrammed to Cecile Julian. A sighting unconfirmed, third hand, delivered through an informant. Kyu-Bong's people had cultivated in the European underworld of a woman matching her description attending an arms auction in Montenegro. Each piece of intelligence landed on Kyu-Bong's desk like a drop of water on a parched tongue. He consumed them obsessively, pinning photographs and maps to a wall in his private office, connecting dots with red string like a detective in a crime drama or a madman in an asylum, and the line between the two had long since blurred. He stopped attending to his crumbling business operations entirely. He canceled meetings, ignored calls from panicking managers, waved away financial reports that showed his empire bleeding from 1,000 invisible cuts. None of it mattered. She was out there. She had surfaced. And the magnetic pull of her, the same gravitational force that had seized him the night he first saw her, sitting in that velvet chair, was as powerful now as it had been 5 years ago. Sang-min watched his boss spiral with the quiet horror of a man witnessing a car crash. In slow motion from inside the vehicle, he ran his own analysis on the trail Cecile was leaving and found it troublingly convenient. Too clean, too sequential, too perfectly calibrated to Kyu-Bong's psychological profile. He said as much, once, in a carefully worded memo that landed on a desk Kyu-Bong was no longer sitting at, because he was standing at the wall of photographs, tracing the line of Cecile's jaw with his fingertip and muttering to himself in Korean. Sang-min filed the memo and began, very quietly, updating his personal exit strategy. The trail converged, as Cecile had designed it to, on Las Vegas. A property purchase in Henderson, 3 miles from his compound, registered to a shell company with a naming convention that echoed the Julian family's old corporate structure. A reservation at a private dining club on the Strip, booked under the name C. Julian brazenly, almost mockingly, as if she were daring him to come. And finally, the piece that sealed it, a single crystal glass of whiskey delivered to Kyu-Bong's penthouse by a courier service no one in his organization had hired, accompanied by a handwritten note on cream-colored stationery. The handwriting was hers. He recognized it immediately, the elegant, slightly leftward slant, the way she crossed her T's with a flourish that suggested amusement. The note contained 2 words. Your move. Kyu-Bong read the note 7 times. His hands were steady, years of discipline had trained the tremor out of them in moments that mattered, but something behind his eyes was not steady at all. Something behind his eyes was vibrating at a frequency that the human body was never designed to sustain, a frequency powered by 5 years of compressed longing and rage that had just found its release valve. He set the note down beside the photograph on his wall, the final piece of the constellation he had been building, the last point of light connecting all the others into a shape he could finally see. She wasn't running, she wasn't hiding, she was inviting him. And the invitation was written in whiskey and cream stationery in the handwriting of the only woman who had ever made him feel something other than the cold, mechanical satisfaction of power. He picked up the whiskey and drank it in a single swallow. It tasted like amber and smoke and the ghost of a fire that had never stopped burning. He smiled. Not the blade-catching light smile of the man she had first met. Something worse. The smile of a man who had been waiting 5 years for his prey to make a mistake, and who believed with the absolute, unshakable certainty of a narcissist, whose paranoia had calcified into prophecy that she had finally made one. He called Sang-min. He called his remaining lieutenants, the 6 he still trusted, including Jeon Tae-sik, who answered the call from a room where a second phone lay, face down on the table, its screen showing a text thread with a number Kyu-Bong's. Surveillance had never detected. He called his head of security. He called in every favor, every asset, every weapon in his diminished but still formidable arsenal. She's here, he told them, his voice vibrating with a dark electric energy that his men hadn't heard in years. She came back, and this time, she doesn't leave. He ordered the Crown Serpent's penthouse prepared. He ordered the VIP floor cleared and sealed. He ordered a security perimeter so dense that a bird couldn't land on the plan. Casino roof without being identified, catalogued, and surveilled. And then he waited. Because Ri Kyu-Bong believed, with every fractured fiber of his obsessive, brilliant, ruined mind, that he was setting a trap, that the chessboard was his, that the king was finally going to capture the queen. He had no idea that the queen had built the board. The Crown Serpent Casino blazed against the Las Vegas night like a monument to ambition and excess, its glass facade reflecting the neon chaos of the Strip in 1,000 fractured colors. Inside, the penthouse level, the 62nd floor, the same private dining level where Cecile had first sat across from Kyu-Bong with candlelight between them and lies on her lips had been transformed into a fortress. Armed men lined the corridors. Surveillance cameras covered every angle. The elevator required a biometric scan to operate, and the stairwell doors were welded shut. Sang-min had coordinated the security setup personally, positioning his best operatives. At every choke point, every exit, every window, the room itself was empty, except for a single table, a single chair, and Ri Kyu-Bong, who stood at the floor-to-ceiling window. With his back to the room, one tattooed hand pressed against the glass, watching the city below with the focused stillness of a predator at the edge of a kill. He had dressed for the occasion. A black suit, sharply tailored, the fabric so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A white dress shirt, unbuttoned to the sternum, revealing the full landscape of ink across his chest, the serpents, the chrysanthemums, the skulls, the Korean scripture that told the story of a boy who had clawed his way out of poverty and built a kingdom from violence. His dark hair was swept back. His jaw was clean-shaven for the first time in months, and the hollows beneath his cheekbones deeper now, sharper, carved by years of sleepless nights. and slow-burning rage gave his face a skeletal intensity that was more frightening than handsome. He looked like what he was, a man on the edge of something irrevocable. He had aged. In the way that powerful men age when power is the only thing sustaining them, not softly, not gradually, but in sharp, sudden increments, each crisis carving a new line, each sleepless night hollowing another shadow beneath his eyes. He was still handsome, still magnetic, still possessed of the same lethal charisma that made rooms fall silent when he entered. But there was a brittleness to him now, a thinness at the edges, as if the version of himself he presented to the world was a mask stretched over, something that had been crumbling for years. At 10:47 p.m., the elevator chimed. Kyu-Bong didn't question how she had passed the biometric scan. He had assumed she would come, and in his obsession he had ordered Tae-sik to program her access, himself never suspecting that Tae-sik had done so 12 hours before the order was given, on Cecile's instructions. The doors opened, and she stepped out, and the air in the room changed the way air changes before a storm charged, heavy, electric with the promise of damage. She walked into the penthouse with the same unhurried grace she had carried into his casino 5 years ago, the same impossible, maddening calm that had seized him the first time he saw her and had never let go. Her heels clicked on the marble floor, the same sound, the same rhythm, the same metronome countdown to something inevitable. And the scent that preceded her, arriving a half-second before her body crossed the threshold, was the scent he had been carrying in his memory like a splinter, lodged beneath his skin for half a decade, warm, layered, unmistakable, the scent that had haunted every sleepless night and empty room for 5 years. But she was different now. The crimson was back, a sharply tailored suit, deep red, fitted at the waist, gold, buttons gleaming down the front. Her dark hair was up in an elegant, voluminous updo that exposed the architecture of her face, the high cheekbones, the flawless bronze. The full lips painted a shade darker than her suit. Gold earrings caught the light. The gold chain from her father hung at her collarbone, and in her right hand, held with the casual ease of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment for half a decade, was a crystal glass of amber whiskey. She looked like a queen returning to claim a throne she had never lost. She looked like the most beautiful weapon ever forged by grief and patience. She looked exactly like the woman who had sat in that velvet chair with blood on the carpet 5 years ago, except that the smirk on her lips was no longer slight. It was radiant, triumphant, the smile of someone who had already won. Kyu-Bong turned from the window. Their eyes met across the room, and the distance between them crackled with 5 years of silence, 5 years of obsession, 5 years of a war fought in shadows by 2 people who had once held hands on a terrace and pretended the world wasn't burning. Cecile. He said her name like a man saying the name of a disease that had been killing him slowly and that he had somehow learned to love. Kyu-Bong. She said his name like a period at the end of a sentence. He stepped toward her. Behind him, his lieutenants materialized from the shadows. 6 men in dark suits, holstered weapons visible, forming a semicircle behind their boss. Song-min stood at the far wall, his cold eyes tracking Cecile with the professional vigilance of a man who had spent 5 years hunting her ghost. The room was sealed. The exits were blocked. The trap was sprung. "You came back," Kyu-Bong said, stopping 10 feet from her. His voice was controlled, but his eyes were wild, feverish, hungry, burning with the same obsessive intensity. She remembered from the night he first leaned over her chair and breathed her in like she was the last clean air in a poisoned world. "I always knew you would." "Did you?" She took a sip of whiskey, unhurried, savoring. "You can't stay away from me, Cecile. You never could. That's the part of you that's real. The part that keeps coming back." She looked at him over the rim of her glass, and something passed between them. Not love, not anymore, but its echo, its scar, the phantom limb of an emotion that had been amputated by betrayal and was still sending signals to a brain that refused to accept its absence. "I didn't come back for you," she said quietly. "I came back for everything else." A flicker in his eyes, confusion, then dismissal, the arrogance of a man who couldn't conceive of a world in which he was not the center. "It doesn't matter why you came," he said. He gestured to the room, to the armed men, to the sealed exits. "You're here, and this time, there's no tunnel, no extraction team, no escape." He stepped closer. "This time, Cecile, it ends the way it was always supposed to end. With you and me, in a room, with nowhere left to run." She didn't step back. She didn't flinch. She looked at him with those dark, steady, depthless eyes. And then she did something that made every armed man in the room tense. She smiled. Not the slight, knowing smirk of the woman who had played him 5 years ago. A full smile, wide and warm and devastating. The kind of smile that reaches the eyes and transforms the face and communicates, with absolute clarity, that the person wearing it knows something you don't. She glanced at her watch, a thin gold piece on her left wrist. She noted the time, 10:52, and looked back up at him. "You're right," she said. "It does end tonight." She took another sip of whiskey, set the glass down on the table beside her, straightened her blazer, and spoke a single word, calmly, conversationally, as if she were ordering dinner. "Now." The room detonated not with fire, but with betrayal. Jian Tae-sik moved first. In a single fluid motion, he drew his weapon and aimed it at the back of Kyu-Bong's head. To his left, Lieutenant Kwan, the man with the gambling debts, the man Cecile had bought 2 years ago with the price of his freedom, turned his weapon on Sang-min. Across the room, 2 more lieutenants pivoted, their guns swinging away from Cecile and toward the remaining loyalists like compass needles, finding a new north. Within 3 seconds, 4 of Kyu-Bong's 6 trusted men had their weapons trained on their own boss and his 2 remaining defenders. The room froze. The kind of freeze that happens when reality fractures and the brain needs a moment to reassemble the pieces in a new configuration. The hum of the climate control system was suddenly audible. The distant pulse of the casino floors, 62 stories below, throbbed faintly through the structure like a heartbeat. Somewhere outside, the lights of the Las Vegas Strip continued their eternal, indifferent performance for an audience that would never know what was happening in this room. Sang-min, who had survived 3 decades in the underworld by reading situations, faster than other men read sentences, assessed the geometry of the room in under 2 seconds. 4 weapons on his side of the equation, 2 on theirs. The math was not complicated. He set his weapon on the floor, slowly, and raised his hands. The second loyalist followed his lead. They were professionals. Professionals survived by knowing when the war was lost. Kyu-Bong's face underwent a transformation that Cecile watched with the detached precision of a surgeon observing a procedure she had spent years planning. First, confusion, the rapid, blinking incomprehension of a man whose reality has just inverted. Then recognition, the slow, creeping understanding that the men he trusted, the men he had ordered to hunt Cecile for 5 years, had been hers the entire time. Then rage, the old, familiar, volcanic fury that had defined him since the night she vanished. And finally, beneath it all, visible only to someone who had once held his hand and felt his pulse and knew the private geography of his pain, collapse. Complete, irreversible collapse. The same shattered look she had seen in the ballroom 5 years. The look of a boy who had learned one more time that everything he touched would eventually betray him. "No," he whispered. Not a denial. A prayer. The last word of a man watching his kingdom crumble in real time. "Yes," Cecile said. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them until he was close enough to see the scar on his jawline, the darkness under his eyes, the faint tremor in his tattooed hands. Your Macau pipeline has been mine for 3 years. Lim. Dae-hyun has been routing your money through my holding companies since before. Your nightclubs started losing their licenses. Your Atlantic City casino is operating on credit extended by a bank I control. Your arms shipments are running through logistics companies I own. Your real estate portfolio is leveraged against debts held by my entities. Your front businesses, the ones that are still open, are generating revenue that flows through 9 intermediary accounts directly into my treasury. She paused, let the silence do its work, the same technique he had used the night of their first dinner, when he stood at the window with his back to her and let anticipation become its own kind of violence. She had learned from the best. Your lieutenants, she continued, gesturing to the armed men surrounding him, have been on my payroll for between 16 months and 4 years. They used your paranoia to isolate you. They used your obsession with finding me to distract you from the slow dismantling of your operation. Every time you fired a manager or replaced an accountant or restructured a division, my people filled the gap. You spent 5 years hunting a ghost, Kyu-Bong, and while you were looking for me in the shadows, I was standing in plain sight, wearing the face of every person you trusted. She paused and looked at him with something that was neither pity nor cruelty, but a complicated tenderness, the kind of tenderness that survives betrayal, that outlasts hatred, that exists in the narrow space between 2 people who have wounded each other so deeply that the wounds themselves have become a form of intimacy. You taught me something, she said. That night on the terrace when you told me this, place was silent before I came. You taught me that the most powerful man in a room is also the loneliest, and that loneliness is a door that no amount of security can lock. I walked through that door, Kyu-Bong, and I never closed it behind me. I just built a new empire on the other side. Kyu-Bong stood motionless. His jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscles in his neck straining. His hands, the tattooed, inked, violent hands that had built an empire and held her face when he kissed her, were shaking. You can't, he started. I already have. She said it without cruelty, without triumph, with the quiet, exhausted finality of a woman who had spent a decade of her life on a single purpose and had, finally, at enormous cost, achieved it. It's done. It's been done for months. Everything. You think you own the properties, the accounts, the supply lines, the loyalty of the men in this room. All of it is mine. You're standing in the middle of my empire. Kyu-Bong, you just didn't know it until now. The silence that followed was absolute. The armed men held their positions. Song-min, disarmed and pinned against the wall by Lieutenant Kwan, stared at Cecile with the flat, unreadable expression of a man whose professional respect for a superior operation was at war with his personal fury at having been outmaneuvered. Kyu-Bong's eyes were locked on Cecile's face, and in them, beneath the rage, beneath the ruin, beneath the shattered pride of a king who had just learned he was a pawn, she saw something she hadn't expected, something that looked impossibly like admiration. You were always better than me, he said. His voice was barely audible, broken. Human, weren't you? It wasn't a question. Cecile looked at him, really looked, the way she had looked at him on the terrace that night, not through the lens of an operative or a rival or an enemy, but with the unguarded eyes of a woman who understood, with painful clarity, that the man standing in front of her was both the architect of her greatest suffering and the only person alive who had ever seen her clearly enough to fall in love with the real version of her. I was always more patient, she said softly. That's not the same thing. She turned to Tae-sik, a single nod. Escort him out, she said. No harm, no restraints. He walks out the front door, alone. She turned to Song-min, still pinned against the wall, his cold eyes tracking her with the unblinking focus of a man calculating his odds of survival. Sang-min stays, she said, calmly. A man who ran intelligence for Kyu-Bong's empire for 30 years is too valuable to discard. I have a use for competent men, assuming they can adapt to new management. Sang-min held her gaze for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Tae-sik gestured, and 2 men stepped forward to flank Kyu-Bong. Not roughly. Carefully, almost respectfully, the way soldiers escort a fallen general from a battlefield. Kyu-Bong didn't resist. He stood still for a moment, his eyes never leaving Cecile's face, and the expression he wore was beyond language, a composite of grief and recognition and loss so total it was almost indistinguishable from peace. He had spent 5 years trying to cage her, and she had spent 5 years building a cage around him, so large he couldn't see the walls. And now, standing in the penthouse of the casino that bore his name but answered to her authority, he understood that the game had been hers from the very first move, from the velvet chair, from the whiskey, from the smirk. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Tae-sik's weapon tracked the call. Movement. Kyu-Bong pulled out a single item, a gold earring, small, delicate, the twin. Of the one Cecile had left on the vanity table in the East Wing 5 years ago, he had kept it. All this time, carried it with him like a talisman, like a wound, like the last physical proof that she had existed in his world, and that the silence she left behind was not a dream. He set it on the table beside her whiskey glass. His tattooed fingers lingered on the surface for a moment, the same fingers that had gripped the arms of her velvet chair. On the night they met, the same fingers that had held her hand on the terrace, the same fingers that had pressed against the cold window of his penthouse on all those sleepless nights when her ghost was the only company he could bear. Then he withdrew his hand. He straightened his jacket, lifted his chin, and walked toward the elevator with the measured, deliberate stride of a man who had lost everything and refused to let the loss change the way he moved through a room. His shoulders were straight. His pace was even. He did not look at his former lieutenants. He did not look at the weapons pointed at the floor. He walked the way he had always walked, as if the ground beneath him existed for the sole purpose of carrying him forward, and in that final defiant display of dignity, Cecile saw the man she had first met, the man who descended the mezzanine staircase of the Crown Serpent, with blood on the carpet and desire in the man who had claimed her and lost her, and been unmade by both. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside, and just before they closed, he looked back at her one final time. The part that was real, he said. I never stopped believing it. The doors closed, the elevator descended, and Ri Kyu-Bong disappeared from the Fawn 62nd floor of the Crown Serpent Casino, leaving behind an empire, a name, and a woman who stood alone in the penthouse with a glass of whiskey in her hand, and a gold earring on the table, and 5 years of war behind her and the rest of her life ahead. Cecile stood in the silence for a long time. Then she walked to the window, the same window where he had stood with his back. To her, on the night of their first dinner, the same glass that had framed the Las Vegas skyline like a painting he owned. She pressed her hand against it, feeling the cold surface beneath her palm, and looked down at the city. His city, her city, now. The lights of the strip stretched below her like a river of liquid gold, and beyond them the desert extended to the horizon, dark and vast and patient, the way she had been. Patient, the way her father had taught her to be patient before the world took him from her and she had to teach herself. She reached up and touched the gold chain at her collarbone, her father's chain, the only thing she had carried through every identity, every safe house, every tunnel, every year of silence. She closed her eyes and let herself feel, for the first time in a decade, the full weight of everything she had accomplished and everything it had cost. The lives she had lived that weren't hers, The man she had loved, who was also the man she had. Destroyed. The empire she had stolen, piece by piece, from the inside out, with nothing but patience and pain and the cold, unshakable certainty that she would not stop until she was sitting in his chair. She opened her eyes. She walked to the chair at the head of the table, the chair where Kyu-Bong had sat during their first dinner, the seat of power, the throne, and she sat down. She crossed her legs. She picked up her whiskey. She took a sip. The gold earring sat on the table in front of her. She looked at it for a long time, this small, delicate thing that he had carried for 5 years, this fragment of a woman who no longer existed, preserved by a man who could not let go of the one person who had ever made his silence bearable. She picked it up, turned it in the light, then she slipped it into the pocket of her crimson blazer, next to the place where her heart beat steadily, behind 2 layers of silk and a lifetime of armor. She would not wear it, but she would keep it, the way she kept everything that mattered, close, hidden, and permanent. The city glittered below her. The room was silent. The war was over. And Cecile Julian, the daughter of a murdered king, the ghost who had walked through walls, the woman who had turned heartbreak into a weapon and patience into an empire, smiled. Not a smirk, not a performance, a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and says, quietly, to no one and everyone, I won. She walked into his casino in crimson with a smirk. He claimed her that night. He had no idea she was the daughter of the man he murdered, sent to bring his empire crashing down. Now she's sitting in his chair, ruling his kingdom. But the question that matters most, did she destroy Kyu-Bong? Or did she destroy the only man who ever loved the real her? Smash that subscribe button. Drop a comment, Team Cecile or Team Kyu-Bong, and tell me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far this story has traveled. See you in the next one.